If you are starting a podcast in 2022 with all the information that you have today, how would things look different? Would you do anything different? Would you do it all the same? Like, this is something that someone recently asked me, and I thought, oh my gosh, we have to talk about this today because I haven't done any kind of content like this for brand new beginners, and there's just so many things have changed since I first started podcasting. So I'm excited to share with you today some of the ups, some of the downs, and some of the do's and don'ts that you should follow when starting a podcast in 2022 and beyond. So let's get right to it. Okay, so there are three main things. We're diving right into this immediately because they are that important, and I want to get as much information into today as possible. And the first one is, what is my goal? The second one is, when do I want to launch? And the third thing that I want you to think about is, what will my format be? And the reason why I bring up these three things and why they're so important to creating a podcast is because they tend to be like not the sexy things that people really want to talk about. People want to talk about the downloads. They want to talk about all the theoretical things that are going to happen with their show whenever it takes off. But let's be honest, it's the tactical and practical things that are actually going to get you from just an idea to having a published podcast. So yes, I think equipment is important. I think what you're going to record, like all those things, but there's a ton of information that you can find on my YouTube channel to help you start a podcast, record a podcast, edit a podcast, all of those things. But I want to start with number one, and that is, what is my goal? What is the goal of your podcast? Why are you doing this? Because if you don't have an understanding of why you're doing this and the bigger picture, you're going to get lost, or you're going to face burnout, or you are just going to wake up one day and say, I do not have the motivation to keep podcasting. And let me tell you, I've been doing this for several years at this point, and there are days whenever I'm like, do I really have to record a podcast today? Yes, me, the podcast coach, the podcast expert, the one that podcasts about podcasting. I still have days where I wake up and I say, do I really have to record an episode right now? But what keeps me going, what pushes me further, and my why for podcasting is helping other people. It's helping you start a podcast. It's showing you how easy it is once you get going, once you understand your goals, who you're talking to, your message, your content, your format, like all of those things become so much easier because if you have a goal, then I can help you reach those goals. You see where I'm going? Like we're like, it's everything's double layered. It's like triple meaning of everything today. But I have a podcast episode on the Proffitt Podcast that you got to go check out. It's episode 112. And it is all about your podcast launch goals. So in the description, we're going to have just all the things that you need to go check out because this one is really important. I spoke to several of my previous students, previous clients, and whenever I ask them, like we get into a session together, that's usually my first question. What is your goal? And there are many things in this particular episode that we talk about, but your goal doesn't have to be to hit number one in the charts or to get 1,000 downloads in your first week. It could be, I just need to be held accountable and I just need to put it out there so that I can get better and start serving my audience. So when you're thinking of your goal, it doesn't have to be some big grandiose gesture that you're like, I have to hit this, otherwise why am I even doing it? No, your goal can be personal to you, but you've got to have one. You've got to have one. So my goal is to help other people that want to help other people. I know everything's just so layered and it's deeper meanings, but it's true. I show up and I keep podcasting because I know that you're watching this, you're listening to this, that you have a really important message to share. And if I can give you the tools and resources to make that happen, then that is why I keep showing up. I keep showing up for you. That is my goal. So I want you to think about, do some brainstorming, do some thinking, go listen to that episode and figure out what is your number one goal for your podcast. Okay, and then number 2 is, when do I want to launch? Okay, this is something like, it doesn't matter if you're watching this or listening to this in January or December, you have to pick a time when you want to launch your podcast. Because what I often see, and this is, it breaks my heart, but also it's like, oh, I wish that you would have found me sooner, because I would tell you just hitting publish on a podcast is not the way to launch it. And this has nothing to do with being in the charts. It has nothing to do with anything around accomplishing something that's like noteworthy with your podcast. It's all about holding yourself accountable and reaching that very first milestone. What is the very first milestone of a podcast? It's just getting it launched, okay? It is literally hitting publish, getting it out to the world. But what I like to see podcasters do is build up a launch runway where they can say, okay, in 4 weeks, I'm going to launch this podcast. And then you have all this build up time where you're telling people, okay, it's coming, like whether it's March 1st, it's like my podcast is going to launch on March 1st. That's when it's coming out. You can tell people the date. You can tell people to go and subscribe to the show before it's ever even out. That way, when it actually does go live, they can go watch it and see it, or, watch it, listen to it, all the things on your actual launch date. So picking a launch date is super, super important. And don't worry, I have a full playlist. I have a full playlist that I'm going to link to in the video description in the show notes that I want you to go check out. But the top 4, okay, these are 4 episodes of the Proffitt Podcast I want you to go listen to. And that is how to launch a podcast. This is one of my very first podcast episodes I released about podcasting, and that's episode 48. Then we have how to pick a launch date. So if you're like, well, Crystal, I know I need to pick a launch date, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know what that looks like. Well, go to episode 88 of the Proffitt Podcast, because I literally walk you through the things that I want you to think about when you're launching a podcast. Things like, what's going on in your personal life? What's going on in your professional life? And how can you balance between the two to actually merge and pick a date that's going to work for both of them? Like if you're in a season of your life is crazy right now and you're really busy and you're like, oh, I'm just going to pick a random Friday, but you know that Fridays are the worst days for you because it's the busiest with your kids or your home life or at work. Like, you really need to think about these things because it will help you have a more successful launch. Okay, so go listen to that episode. Another podcast episode I want you to listen to is a podcast launch plan, how to create yours. So this is episode 91 of the Proffitt Podcast. And the reason why this one is so important is because I go through sort of the basics of a podcast launch plan and what that can look like. So if you're like, well, you keep talking about launching, but I don't really know what that means. What is a launch plan? Go listen to that episode because you'll understand more of the marketing principles of why launching, I'm saying in quotes, launching a podcast is important, because it's not just about getting your show published. It's about building an audience that is ready to listen to your podcast whenever you actually have content out there. And then they're going to be more likely to stick around and come back every single week whenever you have new content out there. But I think that having a launch plan in place can help you have a more successful launch. So go check that out. I have tons of ideas. I have no shortage of ideas when it comes to launching. And I really want you to go check that out. If you're like, I don't even know where to start, it's going to give you a nice runway to help you launch your podcast. All right, the next podcast episode about launching that I want you to go listen to is episode 198, What's the Hardest Part of Launching a Podcast? you really need to go check this out. If you're getting in this mental space of, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I don't know, I'm just going to hit publish. If you keep saying to yourself, I'm just going to hit publish, then please go listen to this episode, because it's going to help you understand the mindsets that you really need to get control of before you're ready to launch your podcast. So this is like step number 2. The first thing we talked about was you got to have a podcast goal. The second is you have to decide when you're going to launch your podcast. And actually, if you're watching the video, I would love for you to tell me in the comments when you're launching your podcast. Like, tell me if you recently launched, tell me that. If you are launching in the future, please tell me in the comments. I would love to give you a shout out and celebrate with you, because it's a big deal. When you're announcing your podcast launch date, it is a really big deal, because you're holding yourself accountable. You're telling the world, okay, this is my goal to launch a podcast, and this is when I'm going to make it happen. So tell me in the comments. I would love to hear all about it. Okay, the third thing that we need to talk about is, what will your format be? So formatting a podcast, I always tell people when they ask me like, well, what's the rule? What's the rule to format my podcast this way? Or what's the rule for this? And I got to tell you, there are no rules. I know, like someone that's like, this is what I do. I talk to people all the time and I'm like, there's no rules. I call them guidelines, but I won't be the one to tell you it needs to be released every Tuesday. It needs to be exactly 27 minutes and 13 seconds. And it needs to have this many solo episodes. And no, y'all, there's none of that. The format that you choose for your show is going to be what works for you. And then you can always change it in the future. But you have to have something to begin with. So for those of you that get overwhelmed really easily with all the options, I'm raising my hand here because this has been me on multiple occasions in creating content. I feel like I need at least a few, like just give me a few possibilities for creating a podcast format. I would ask yourself a few questions. Do you want to have solo episodes where it's just you and your microphone and you're talking to your audience? Do you want to have interview episodes where it's you interviewing another expert in your industry or someone that you know could add value to your audience? Or do you want to do a mixture of both? This is typically what I'm talking about when it comes to your format. Another thing to consider is your episode length. How long do you want your episodes to be? Y'all, you don't have to have an hour-and-a-half long podcast episode to call it a podcast. My daily show, The Potty Report, is 5 minutes or less. Monday through Friday, 5 minutes or less. I figured that would be better than once a week as a 25-minute episode. So it's totally up to you and how you want to create your content, but you do need to make a few of these key decisions before you start recording, because then you'll have this baseline expectation of how you want to create your content. But don't worry, if you want to change things in the future, go check out my podcast. I've changed so many things about my podcast over the years, but you need something to at least get started with. Okay, and before we wrap up today, I wanted to share with you a few other things, and this is what we're going to call where to not waste time. So if you're thinking about launching your podcast, no matter what time of year it is, I want you to ask yourself the question, where am I getting stuck? Okay, because this is what could possibly be what holds you back. And I have a few things to kind of get your brain going to give you some red flags to where you may be getting stuck and you don't even know it. You may think that it's disguised as something else. And one of the things that I see a lot of people wasting time and getting stuck is perfectionism. So you are editing your podcast and you're like, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. I said 17 times, or I said the word like, I said so too much. I did this, I did that. My voice is to this, it's to that. Y'all, don't get caught up in perfectionism. Okay, you have to get to a point where you say, you know what, this is good enough. I'm going to get better over time. Otherwise, you'll never get your podcast out there. So don't let perfectionism keep you stuck. I want you to get it to a point where your podcast episodes are good enough. Put them out there and keep telling yourself, I'm going to get better over time. So another place, the second place where I see people getting stuck is the strategies that they're creating are not aligning with their goals. So I want you to go back to step one, what we talked about earlier, and ask yourself, okay, this is my goal. Is everything that I'm trying to do aligning with my goal? So if your goal is to just get your podcast out there at a certain date, at a certain time, then you're putting all this extra pressure on yourself to do it in in a week. Y'all, that's too stressful. Launching a podcast the right way in a week is a little too much, but at the same time, if that's all you need to get your podcast out there, then you can make it happen. It can work, but if it's to have this sustainable audience that's built in and you know that they're going to come back every single week, then I would encourage you, or I guess I should say challenge you, to take a little bit more time to plan out your strategies a little bit more to have everything aligned with your long-term podcast goals. All right, another thing that we need to talk about is trying to do too many things. I'm guilty of this as well, and I have absolutely fallen prey to the idea of I got to have a YouTube and a podcast and all the social media platforms and build my email list and create a new website and, right? You know what I'm talking about. We put all this pressure on ourselves to do all of the things. I'm going to ask you to ask yourself, what is the priority? What is your priority? If your priority is to launch a YouTube channel, then awesome. Go do that first. If your priority is to get your email list going and then you want to start your podcast, fantastic. Do that first and then create your podcast. But don't get caught up thinking, I have to do all the things right now, otherwise none of it is worth it. It's too much. Don't put that kind of pressure on yourself, and don't get sucked into thinking that you have to do everything at once. Ask yourself, what is my priority today? And that should be the thing that you're focusing on. And then the last thing I want to tell you about really just it ends up being a time suck. You're wasting your time, and that's trying to build a platform before you launch. This kind of goes back into the perfectionism ideas, and I see this happen a lot where somebody will say, well, I will launch my podcast when? I will concentrate more on my podcast when I have X amount of followers, or I have so many people on my email list, or I have my perfect website built that's getting tons of traffic to it. Don't wait. Don't wait. I've been doing this long enough to tell you that you're going to get better over time. Your audience will grow, right? It's just a matter of how fast or how slow. It's going to depend on it's just so many other things, right? Your niche, your topic, your category, your audience, your platform that you already have. But don't get stuck in the mentality that your message isn't good enough until you have a platform. You are perfectly capable right now, today, to launch your podcast. Your message is good enough for you to put it out there and share it with the world. But that's all I have for you today. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit the thumbs up and subscribe below. That way you don't miss our future videos that we put out every single week, all about podcasting and running your online business. Make sure you check out these other videos right here, all about podcasting and running your online business. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.